Hi everyone, welcome to Mitchell Giddings Fine Arts. Thank you for being here tonight to support the gallery, our artists, and especially painter and printmaker Susan Osgood. As most of you know, Susan works in Egypt each year, employed by the University of Chicago as an archaeological illustrator. I imagine being presented with ancient maps or carved figures would demand a literal focus or clarity, on clarity of detail and a certain stylized rendering of her objects. It's our good fortune to display Susan's fine art, which allows her to explore ideas and mysteries hinted at or suggested by the artifacts, using methods of image making not necessarily possible otherwise. It's our double good fortune to also welcome poet GennaRose Nethercott, who shared her responses to Susan's artwork through her poetry and collaborated with Susan to create the book A Ghost of Water, Poems by GennaRose Nethercott, inspired by the art of Susan Osgood. Please welcome Susan Osgood. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. And thanks, too, for Jim and Petey for creating this place to support the arts and celebrate them, and to Aaron and Lori, who work for them. Andy and your assistant, who are videoing, thanks a lot. And to Mark, my husband, The Rock, who does everything from art handling to editing to everything. Thank you. So, I grew up across the river in the wilds of Westmoreland. My mother was a hairdresser. She did hair in our kitchen, and my father was a tool and die maker. And we didn't go to see art. But all of us ended up, there were 2 older brothers, 2 younger sisters. We all ended up either or both doing music or art or something. What I really got out of that time, can everyone hear? Is it good? What I got out of that time growing up in Westmoreland is nature and quietude and focusing on moths and birds and anything. And I think I've carried that all the way up into my artwork, that it's all about kind of becoming totally involved in something. And I think nature does that, and art can do that, and many other things. But that's something that I've carried with me. I also got really involved in creative projects when I was young, all kinds of different things like embroidery and liquid embroidery and just lots of things. And I think I learned, and I remembered once, I'm remembering that I had the family, we had 7 people in our family, but I would remember quiet mornings as a kid. I'd lie down on the living room floor and read the Boston Globe and collect those little places where you could send off for a travel brochure from Spain or Morocco or somewhere. And I would send away for them, and then I'd wait and I'd get them in the mailbox. And so I really wanted to travel ever since I was young. And as Jim mentioned, I did end up getting a pretty good, awesome job that supports my art and gets me traveling. My big decision that kind of turned the corner for me is when I was in high school. I dropped out of Algebra 2, and I just said, I can't do this. So I went to my teacher, and I told her I'm going to drop out of Algebra 2. And she gave me this lecture about, well, you have to climb these mountains, and there's things you have to do in life, and you just have to do them. And I said, thanks. And I just walked away, and I went to take more art classes. I never told my parents or anything, but the teacher was a very meticulous representational painter, and I learned color theory and portrait painting, landscape painting. That's where I really started off. And eventually I ended up at the Rhode Island School of Design. And it was really the only place I wanted to go. And I applied, didn't get in. So I went off, and I essentially ran away from home and went to Europe and traveled around there for a bit, and came back and applied again, and I got in, and I never regretted it. It was an amazing experience. At the very end of my time there, I started to work abstractly, and I didn't plan it. It worked out that way. I just fell into, I was painting my studio, corner of my studio. It was a painting about this big, one of the largest ones I'd done. And I kept working on it, changed the floor color, red and green and yellow. And then finally, at the very end, it was just about the light that was streaming in and stretching across the parquet floor. And then the next painting was a very big painting, and it was simply the light on the floor. And then after that, I really went abstract. So it wasn't planned, it happened. And I think what I like the most about it, and I'm always trying to be, how do you describe abstract art? How do I describe my work? I think it's a challenge. And I would say that I'm really trying to evoke not an intellectual experience, but an emotional experience, and have it be, for me, a process that is exciting and challenging and takes me places that I haven't been before. So I kind of demand that of each piece that I do, and I really like challenge. And that's sort of where this work comes out of, that I'd been painting for 40 years, and I wasn't so excited about it anymore. And a friend said, oh, come, let's do printmaking. So I said, oh, okay. It was downtown at the River Gallery School. And I had studied printmaking before, and I found that it was really, each piece is a surprise. The process of monotypes, which all of these are, is that you have a plate. You can paint on the plate, you roll ink on the plate, you can take it away with your fingers, with scrapers, with anything. And you can also add things onto that. Some of these have seaweed, some have like a gauze, some have yarn, some have dried tiger lily fronds from my garden as I was cutting my garden back. And you can print over and over. You only get one print, so it's not, sometimes people think prints are multiple and you can get many, but monotype means you get one. But I could send each piece of paper through the press a number of times, and I can keep adding to it. It's a little bit like watercolor in that you have to keep, if you want whites, you have to keep them from the beginning, and you can't find them again. With oil painting, you can always add white or light color back in, but monotypes, you're kind of stuck. So it's a little bit more of a challenge for me. These series, and let's see what to tell you first. These series here, it's a couple of different series, and they came after I discovered a map that was from, a copy of a map that was from the 1100s. And I looked at it, and I didn't know what it was. It was fascinating to me. It was simply abstract lines, curving, dancing from page to page. And the map originally was considered accurate for 300 years. But I looked at it for several days, and I only saw, and what I realized afterwards was north was at the bottom and south was at the top. So I'd totally gotten turned around. But the map, in a way, reintroduced me to line, and a lot of these works represent that inspiration. And I like using multiple pieces of paper, because I'll start with one. For example, these are called diptychs, these two, the red pieces there. And I'll have two pages that come together, but I start with one I don't have the other half. So I complete one half, and then I decide what's going to go with that, how that'll work. And it's a little bit like life in that nothing ever really quite fits together perfectly. And I like that slight agitation or disconnect. After the next series is the Map of Water series, which begins with the piece behind me, and it's continuing. It began with the idea of, okay, maps, but then I went out from that and thinking conceptually and thinking, well, what if you could, like, the quality of water is changing. What did I hear? UNESCO just said that in the next generation, if we continue on, we'll have more plastic in the water than fish. Things like that, that just, I wouldn't say those are, they're kind of inspirations, but my work is fueled by these ideas, but it's not per se about them. But I began to think of, well, will we need a map of water? Would we need a map of water to tell us the essence of water? Not anything more than that, but will we lose that? So I started with the piece behind me. The next one was another piece off to this side here that it actually has a figure in it, which came later. And the way I work is that I don't really have an idea in mind, and I like that. I like seeing where it'll take me. It's a little bit like jazz or free form, working free form, that I'll begin with an idea, and sometimes I don't end with that idea at all. It'll turn into something totally different. And I also like the excitement of that. So in 2014, Mark and I were walking along the street in Brattleboro, and GennaRose Nethercott was sitting there writing poems for hire, and we said, let's order a poem. So we did. We gave her Words to Live By was our topic. And we went off, had a cup of tea, and got this little scrap of paper, hand-typed on a typewriter. And it's a beautiful little poem. So I shared it with a friend of mine in Germany who's a patron and has created many shows for me there, and who I met through Egyptology, actually. And he ordered a couple poems from GennaRose as well. And then I hear from him, we need to do a book. You need to ask GennaRose if she will write about your artwork. So I said, okay. So I took that idea in and contacted GennaRose. And we had this lively discussion. Really, it was sort of how we met, and talking about these concepts of maps and what's a map anyway, and how long is it really good for, because rivers change course, and so many things are always in transition, and yet we think of our maps as a constant thing that we can go by. And we talked about that. We talked about, in the process of monotypes, there's something called a ghost, where you send your paper through the press, you take off the paper, and you still have ink on your plate. So you can send that through again, and you can get something called a ghost. So we started talking about ghosts, and I don't know, so many things. It was a really fueled, fired introduction. And you liked the idea, GennaRose liked the idea, and so we went with it. And that was probably 2015. I didn't see the poems until maybe last year. And it's, for me, the experience of collaborating. Usually an artist, we work alone, we put up our show, it's up for a little while, then we take it down. And you maybe see some people at the opening, and then it goes. So, and artists, I think, sometimes will communicate with each other, but a lot of times not. Maybe it's, talk about your flower garden or something else, but it's sometimes kind of a lonely field. So to share and collaborate, for me, was has been a great experience. I likened it a little bit to Alice in Wonderland and stepping through the looking glass, where this whole other world opened up, and these poems about each of my pieces that had characters and history in them and mystery, it opened up a whole different world. So it was a beautiful, and still is, collaboration. Another thing that came out of that is letting go of control. I think a lot of times we like to get more control until everything is just right. And it really doesn't work that way with this, that I had to let go and say, here's somebody's view of my work, and go with that. And that too was a really great experience. Let's see, what else can I tell you? When Petey came to me to join the gallery, that was in, maybe it was 2 years ago, and then last year she invited me to have this show. So I said, well, I'm in the midst of creating this book, so maybe we could coordinate and have the work from the book be part of the show. So that got us really excited and fired up, and it has been a really nice opportunity to have poems, the art, a reading, so many aspects to this one show. And I chose the work for the book and then decided that, okay, if the show is going to really involve the book, that's the work I'll put in the show. And so that's how I landed on this group of pieces. I think that's what I have to say about my work. I've had a couple of different opportunities to be at the Vermont Studio Center and work doing printmaking there, and at a printmaking center in Florence, Massachusetts called Zia Mays Printmaking, where I was this spring and had a big old press and great community of people, and created a couple of pieces on the back walls here that are literally inspired by the Connecticut River and the loops and oxbow and shapes of it, and imagining, well, what was the river like before the glacier? Or where was this a whole pool of water? What's left from that time? What will it be after so many years from now? How will it change from there? So that was a really great opportunity to be there. I want to invite GennaRose up to join me for questions and answers, and also to read a couple of her poems, if you would. Poems first.
Poems first. Hi, everybody. I'm gonna read just one, two. What do you want?
How is the mic, Andy? You're okay?
Cool.
Good.
One poem, two poem, what were we?
Two.
Two? Okay. So I'm just going to read a couple of the poems from the book, A Ghost of Water. As Susan was saying, I was tasked with writing pieces based on her prints. So I was given this work, and I got to know the work not just by studying it, but by writing about it, which was a really special way to delve into her body of work, especially since neither of us were very familiar with each other's pieces before we started working together. So yeah, it was just a very special and kind of in-depth way of getting to know this art, was excavating it through writing about it. And I'm just going to read a couple of them. This first one is called The First Map, sort of a fable. The First Map. Once upon a time, people saw mountains and wilderlands and caverns and riverbeds, and the people shook, 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 down to their skeletons, and their skeletons shook, crying out, "Oh, this land is too great. This land is larger than our bones and flesh and mouths can fathom, too large for our eyes, too wide for our hands." And they rattled like dust, for fear of their own smallness. Then a woman took a flat stone, and into the stone she carved the mountains and the wilderlands and the caverns and the river beds. The people gathered around the stone, and they saw the world was now small enough for their eyes to swallow and their hands to lift. And the people ceased their shaking. Then the people saw the sky, and they shook, 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 down to their bones. "Oh, this cosmos is too great, larger than our bones and flesh and mouths can fathom, too large for our eyes, too wide for our hands." And so the woman carved tiny stars into the stone, and a moon no larger than a thumbprint, and the people ceased their shaking. Then the people discovered love, and they shook, 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 and they cried out, "Oh, this feeling is too great, larger than our bones and flesh and mouths can fathom, too large for our eyes, too wide for our hands." So the woman carved words into a stone, and the words became a poem. They read the words, and the love became small enough to speak and name and fit in their palms. They traced the etchings of the pastures with their fingertips, and they felt bolder than the rain that fed the crop. They took the whole sky in their arms. They became too large for their bones and flesh and mouths to fathom. They shook, and they shook, and they shook. Any requests for a second one?
You choose.
Huh?
You choose.
A number.
I like the last one.
The last one? I'm back.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess I didn't let you choose.
It's your day. So this next poem is the back of the book. And so this was the final poem that I wrote for this project. And I wasn't sure what to say that could both encapsulate the sort of project as a whole as well as be an independent piece. And then Susan sent me a card that had this story in it that she had heard recently about the Connecticut River and the West River, where apparently there was a legend that said once the river was so bountiful with salmon that you could just walk right across the top of the river on the salmon's backs to the other side. So I was like, great, a poem. And this is what it yielded. It's called "My Sister Teaches Me to Walk on Water." And it goes with this image too, which is the book's cover wrappings, which is also behind you right there. My sister teaches me to walk on water. First, we catch an eel. Snap it still, dangle it over the current like a gauntlet. The salmon come hungry, froth the river silver, so many the stream bed turns half solid with scales. I learn to keep my eyes open, no matter how bright the thrashing, to step quick, to go barefoot, across the fish, atop the water. When we die, my sister says, this is where we'll come. Every salmon had a human name once, had a mama like ours who baked bread on Saturdays, had someone who loved them. Everybody knows only the loved become ghosts. There is always a surplus or a lack of water, tempest or thirst, a vessel sunk at sea, or a farmer's field withered dry. The sky is a poor measure, never gets it quite right. In times of drought, I do not know where the dead go. I turn a spigot and dust flows out. I visit the hollow riverbed and recall those silvery bodies, waxed and writhing, our arms outstretched for balance, the cool on the pinks of our feet, the careful steps we take across all the lost beloveds as we make our way to the other shore. Thank you.
I wanted to add that since I met GennaRose on the street in 2014, this past August, she was awarded the National Poetry Series Award for 2017 and will be publishing her next book through HarperCollins, and worked with Louise Gluck on editing it, and it's all edited and it's very exciting, very prestigious. So, we're ready for any questions you may have. Linda.
I'd like to hear the first poem, the one that you wrote on the street.
Oh,
It's in the back.
it's in the book, which we have many copies of, and
All right.
they're up at the desk.
For sale.
Yes.
With your money. So the way that I write these is I sit on the street with a typewriter and a little table, and passersby can offer me whatever topic they want, and I'll compose a poem on the spot within 3 to 4 minutes, read it aloud, and hand it off to them to keep. So
She's made 20,000 or so of them up to date.
it's unreasonable, frankly. So this was written in map style on the fly on the street. And yeah, the topic that I was given was words to live by. Never drink down the Atlantic Ocean. That much salt doesn't sit well in the stomach. So many drowned ships which catch in the back of the throat. So many shards of coral, barnacles, lost bottles, and shark's teeth. Never swallow the sea, because when you do, you swallow its longing down with it. Every lover separated by continents. Every sailor that never returned to shore. Drink down the ocean and drink down too many ghosts. No one can sleep after gulping so much want.
I have a question for Susan. So you put painting on a back burner to do printmaking, but I assume you're going to paint again.
I've been doing some painting too.
So my question is, how has printmaking, if at all, informed your painting process, or has it changed it in any way?
So everybody hear that question? How is the printmaking, how has it or will it? Maybe it's more like how will it? Because I don't feel like I've really dived back into painting, but maybe more line and maybe, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. Yeah. Paul.
Everything on display here is a print?
Everything in this section, those two pieces are collages. So they're drawn, painted. They're using all early topographical maps and pasted them on and then painting and drawing over them. These are all prints. Yep.
There are two paintings in the stairwell as well.
Yes, and there are two paintings in the stairwell, oil paintings, and two on the front street that are oil paintings that have pretty much been done during this same period. John.
Susan, how much do you, I've got questions for both of you actually. How much do you think all of the time that you've spent in Egypt looking at those walls and walls and walls of the hieroglyphs has affected the imagery that you do at home?
I would say more of an influence is being in that culture
Yeah.
that seems so foreign, and it is so foreign. Looking at the walls, it was interesting. I was saying with the piece behind you that has a figure in it, I was saying, wow, I haven't done figure drawing in a really long time. And they said, you do figure drawing every year, because I'm copying figures. So I don't know. That's a hard question. It's a good one, but it's a hard one.
Yeah. And as far as the poetry is concerned, I mean, I'm a musician, and I've worked with poets in the past where it was spontaneous sort of improvisation musically, and the poetry would be improvisational also. When you looked at Susan's paintings, how quickly did the images for that poem, for that piece, how quickly did that stuff come to you? Pretty quickly, or?
I mean, I spent a couple months with the works, and I actually had physical small prints of all the ones I was working with, and I put them all up on my wall of my bedroom and tiled them there, so that every day I was just sort of like absorbing them and spending time with them and familiarizing myself with their ambiance and colors and shapes. But I'm a very narrative poet, as you probably noticed, and so with each print I kind of tried to find some concrete handhold within it that could be the jumping off point, sort of the prompt for that next piece.
Yeah.
And I started seeing kind of landscapes and images and characters and worlds, and that was really the fuel, I think, that created the momentum for it. And if you read the book, they tie together a lot. There are reoccurring characters, reoccurring scenes, so it was slow to start, but then once I started, each poem kind of laid groundwork for the next one, and each print was kind of, many of the prints are tied together, and they have overlapping qualities, and the book is in these 3 sections, kind of color palette sections. And so, yeah, so the fact that it was a series as opposed to just isolated images and isolated poems helped quicken that and move it along forward and kind of snowball effect as it went through.
Did you have the layout, did you put the layout of the book, how the pictures the sequence of the pictures in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just how it was emailed to me, honestly.
I think I decided that I had a bunch of the red pieces, and the book just evolved into having the center being mainly the red pieces. The beginning is the collages that were really influenced by the map, and then the map of water pieces at the end. So there's this maybe color and these sections that are kind of separate from each other. So I presented it like that. I guess I gave you the layout. And
and I remember being like, this is the order, right? Because there's a narrative arc here, and if it's not,
but then
we're in trouble.
one got added in. We needed to have one more because books have certain numbers of pages, and you need to, I don't know how it works, but quickly,
there were too many end
so
pages.
we added one of those that's around the corner in, or over there. Yeah, so, and then some, you had to add one in the middle there.
Insert one in the middle. Yeah. But I think for the most part it was just you sent it to me in that order, and I was like, okay, this is the order of the narrative, and worked from there.
Yeah.
Nice. Thanks.
Jonathan.
When you're working in Egypt, you're right up against the Nile River. And do you think about the Nile River? Have you gone up the Nile River?
I have to cross it every day on my commute to work, and I've traveled on it some, and there's
a lot of activity.
There's a lot of activity, although it's not a river that's like our rivers, where you can't just get a boat and go on it. You need permission, and some people swim in it, but some people get lost swimming in it. even if they know how to swim. There's certain currents and stuff. So it's, for me, it has a kind of a mystique that's a little bit scary. Does that answer your question?
It's been there a long time.
It's been there a long time, in one form or another. Petey.
I'm curious how printmaking satisfies your image making and how different that is from painting. How does that satisfy you?
I think the process of printmaking is different from painting because with painting you can add and subtract as you need, and it's also on canvas. I'm talking about oil painting, which is a different surface. Printmaking, the press actually presses the inks into the paper, which somehow is just a different tactile and a different look. The paper absorbs the ink and the paints, and you don't get that with painting. I haven't really had to articulate this, so it's an interesting question. And it's also, prints happen fairly succinctly and quickly. Maybe they might go on for a couple of sessions or so, like the bigger ones. But a painting can go on for a long time, and a lot of struggling with it. And I think also that art historically, oil paintings have this weight, and works on paper are a little bit lighter. I feel that. I feel a little bit more freedom when I'm working with monotypes, and I feel with painting it's sort of like the weight of the art historical world is pressuring me to do something really great, and sometimes I just can't do it. Any other questions? Linda?
Yeah, I'm thinking about mapping, and mapping usually is giving you a direction of where to go or identifying what is, and you've just used it in a different kind of way.
That's a good way to think about it.
So can you talk about it a little bit?
Linda said that maps give you a direction, and I think I might have gotten to a place where I needed some kind of direction. That's the way I heard your comment. I think the concept of mapping is pretty broad, and there's been some art books recently about all kinds of mapping. Dennis Wood did this book of his neighborhood and maps of all of the pumpkins that have been carved and put out, or maps of the streetlights. So he and his students would lie on the ground and look up, and then they'd use satellite images as well. So between looking from above and looking from below, they'd create maps of the streetlights in their town.
Does he have a new book?
Yeah, I think it's called Everything Sings. And he was interesting. He's a geographer who studied geography. It sounded like he was about my age. And he came of age, was in college in the 70s, and was resisting, and during the war and everything. And up until then, maps were done for governments. They were done for traveling. They were done for specific reasons to use them. And he wanted to break out of that form. So he really did. He left geography. He couldn't. I think he's teaching now, and that has given him much more freedom to think about maps in a really broader sense.
And I know that when I was working with the pieces, when I was working on the poetry, I was thinking a lot about, that purpose of a map as a guidance and a representation of what is. And you talked about that some earlier tonight, where a map is a static, concrete, it's a representation of something as it was in the moment that it was captured, but things are constantly changing. We talked about how can you map water, because water is not a constant, it's always moving. And then I thought a lot about how map relates to memory, where it's a memory tool in certain ways as well, in addition to a navigational tool. It helps us remember the landscape of a place or of a culture or of a city. And so what does it mean then when you leave something out? What is the significance of what the cartographer chooses to include in the map versus what the cartographer chooses to exclude, and the power of that? Because essentially by including something, you're saying this thing will be remembered. By excluding it, you're saying this thing may be forgotten. And how much power lies in accepting or dictating what the community consciousness is willing to forget. Yeah.
I thought too of the Aboriginal people in Australia who sing their maps. They sing that stone and that mountain and that piece of land that's dry or something, and that's how they knew to get where they were going. So, and also some Aboriginal people who you put them in a hotel that's like every section of the hotel is the same, but they're in different, every room is the same, but they're in different orientations. With the windows closed, they know where north, south, east, and west is. And how often do you know where north, south, east, and also in Egypt, you'll ask, where is that shop, and they'll say it's east, and then you go north and north this way is called ocean, and which for them north is ocean, and sunset, like west is the word for west is sunset, and the word for east is sunrise. And so we've just over the years, I think people have used our own geographical ways of thinking very differently. And now we're using these little phones that show us a little corner of our universe.
The Aboriginals paint their dreams also.
Yes, painting your dreams. Yeah. Steve.
Well, that gets to something that I would like to emphasize, which is the fact that in this case you're mapping the unknown. And to me that's really so important because it makes you into an adventurer, an explorer. Not a cartographer who has been out to see this place and is depicting it to share. You're going somewhere else, to this unknown realm. And it's almost like the difference between IQ and emotional intelligence. And so maybe you could speak just a little bit about how that adventure feels to have chosen the unknown as your goal.
That reminds me that something that I use a lot as a statement is painting and drawing are forms of travel, giving the sense of being lost and then the wonder of discovery. So that's like the process that I go through where I'm lost. I'm lost, but I'm searching. And I think to allow myself to be lost for as long as I can possibly stand it is such a great experience. And I think we want to know everything. We want to know what our life is going to be and where we're going to land and what's going to happen next. And it's really not like that. We never know. We never really know. And how long can I suspend myself in that place of not knowing before I need to then come back in and say, okay, and maybe here's the composition, and I can figure it like that, and the colors, and think of it more in terms of the literal sense. But somehow I like dangling in that, in the breeze, so to speak.
Don't you think that art is just a process of letting go?
It is. In the best form, art is about letting go. And you can be pretty tight. I mean, people can never let go at all and still be very famous artists. So it's not a necessary ingredient, but...
I mean, ultimately.
Ideally. Yeah, yeah. Susan.
Thank you. Although I understand what you're saying when you're thinking about mapping,
you're right that a map is a snapshot of a place in a moment in time. But when I look at your work, Susan, I see fluidity and movement. Even though they're a solid piece of something, to me they're moving back and forth and forward and back. And so they're maps of, if you want to use that word, the past, the present, and the future all at once. And you're kind of in that vortex when you walk into the work. And I think that's what's so all-encompassing about them.
What a nice view.
Well, and I think we did talk about that in our initial discussions when we were starting to collaborate, was what would a map of water look like if it were possible? If one were to take something that was in motion and was changing and try to convey that in a static form that still conveys its changeability and its motion and its intangibility, what would that physically look like? And I think you had already done that in the work, which was probably why you were thinking about those questions in the first place. But
after the fact.
yeah, it's sort of how does one represent simultaneously on something static like a piece of paper, but still capture that same motion.
And the challenge is, how much can you capture on that piece of paper? How much can you pack in there, still have it work? And it gets me back to John's question of, to be in Egypt or anywhere, travel anywhere and get some other kind of experience, see some other layers of history, hear loud cacophony and get lost. And how can you put that all on one piece of paper? I mean, can you? And that's just such a wonderful challenge. And I can only hope that anybody who really looks at art and really stands there and takes a breath and is willing to dangle there in the wind and see what the piece brings up for them will be able to get in that place a little bit of just being lost and wondering. I mean, sometimes I always think of driving along, you'll see something in a tree for 2 seconds, however many seconds it is. What is that? What was that? Oh, it's a kite. Okay, you can just keep going. You don't have to think about it again. But those few seconds are so beautiful and so precious and magic. And I think growing up and being in nature and wandering and running around and painting backs on turtles to see if we could number all the turtles in the pond. And we dangled in that place for hours and days. It was just such a beautiful experience. Somebody else must have a question. Yes.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that this whole concept and the catalyst, you're stopping to have her write a poem, and where you took it, and the end result is just quite marvelous. And really, both of you would be commended for it. But I have a question. Have you thought about doing the opposite, doing the reverse?
We've talked about it. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. But yeah, we thought it would be interesting for me to write a series of poems and then see what Susan created from that. Yeah. But it's a big undertaking. Yeah, we'll find out. Time will tell.
Yeah. Stay tuned.
Yep.
Chris.
I love the collaborative effort that you have put into this. And I think if you think of before you first met, had you ever thought of doing, not with each other, but just in general, some kind of collaborative work with another artist?
It has happened. Actually, Susan wrote about my work in general, not about, it was about that drawing.
It was about being lost.
Yeah, yeah. I hadn't, let me think about this. I guess when you have a show with two people, that's sometimes kind of collaboration in a way, but you still come to it, two separate entities. But no, and someone asked me last time when GennaRose was reading, would you do it again? Or you asked me that. And I thought, I don't know if it could be ever as good as this time.
And yeah, I've done collaborative works, but nothing like this. The closest thing I feel like, well, I do a lot of freelance work where I'll be hired to write a poem for an individual or a business in the same way that I do on the street, but this is sort of like a more expansive commission. And so I've, for example, worked for an architectural firm who brings me on to write poems based on their houses, which is kind of a similar concept in that it's a piece of visual art that I'm then writing a poem based on, which ekphrasis is poetry based on visual art. So I've worked in that realm before, but what's so different about this is that, you know, when working for an architectural firm, for example, it has to be sort of like a cheerleader for their houses because it's being given as a gift to their clients, and it's not as much about exploring anything, any story that comes up. It has to represent it in a specific way that fits for advertising, where something like this, I was able to really have creative freedom, which was so incredible, and was able to tell stories that could be darker or more complex, or, you know, I didn't have to sell anything. So while I have written many poems based on other people's work or other images, other objects in the past, this was definitely, for one, the most large-scale creative collaboration of this kind, as well as just the one with the most freedom and that offered me the most sort of like exciting territory to explore.
How does your art, or like making your art, change how you think throughout the day, or like your actions?
That's a good question, Elsie. I think it can flip both ways, because once you start looking and doing artwork, then you look more. So I probably don't, I tried to explain to my eye doctor why it is that I brought in some of my drawings and I said, you know, this is how I work and this is what I need. And he said, oh, now I see that regular people we look, it's not dangerous, okay, we don't have to think about it again. But I think artists, we look and we look more, and we look at colors and we look at lines. And it's a very interesting question, because I probably don't even think about it too much anymore, because that's who I am and what I do. But as I go throughout the day, I think it's all about really seeing. And I think that's what artists ask people to do. We ask people to stop and really see, because not everybody does. So I think I feel pretty grateful to have such a profession and such a passion that takes me out into the world, and I see and I look and listen, and we're almost like, and I think it's the same for other artists, that we're almost oversensitized to the world.
And I definitely feel like, as a poet, I've always thought of poetry, sort of one of its jobs is to present people with things that they see all the time and experiences that they've already had, and sort of the banalities of the world that they're used to, but then make them see it in a completely new way, so it surprises them. And so when you get in that mode of thinking in a regular basis, it just means that as I engage with the world day to day, I'm able to look at things and see them as a surprise, even if I've seen them before, or see them in new ways, or see like metaphorical content within them. So yeah, I think definitely the role of the artist involves just like an eye-opening and like a hyper-awareness.
Does that answer your question, Elsie? Thanks. Anyone else?
Any more questions? Susan and GennaRose, thank you so much.
Thank you.